The sun was risen upon the earth, when Lot entered into Zoar. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham got up early in the morning, to the place where he stood before the Lord. And he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the plain, and beheld, and lo, the smoke of the country went up, as the smoke of a furnace. Should one pay a visit to the town of Port Royal, Jamaica, they would find nothing but a small fishing community of some 2,000 people. Situated on the rump end of the Palisadoes Peninsula, it houses an abandoned naval base, the headquarters of the Jamaican Coast Guard, and a cruise port. The modern settlement is far from analogous to the riotous city which once there existed, now swallowed beneath the ocean, and infamously known as the Sodom of the New World. Sodom and Gomorrah were two ancient cities, and according to biblical legend, destroyed in heavenly fire for the many sins of its wicked inhabitants. They were accused of pride, apathy, idleness, and sexual crimes, prime being intercourse with other men. In the 17th century, sodomy denoted a slew of sexual sins, but primarily denoted what we now call homosexuality. A cleric arrived in Port Royal and left shortly thereafter. He left us the following comment. This town is the Sodom of the New World, and since the majority of its population consists of pirates, cutthroats, whores, and some of the vilest persons in the whole of the world, I felt my permanence there was of no use, and I could better preach the word of God elsewhere among a better sort of folk. The cleric would not merely have met a ramshackle town of shacks and lean-tos, but a veritable capital of the English Americas. Port Royal housed some 6,000 inhabitants, living in two-storied structures of red brick, rivaling those in London. The rent was similar. Babylon may have been a label as fit as Sodom, for the unstable ground was unsuited for such prideful constructions. The town existed in defiance against nature itself. To think that only a few decades prior, the Palisadoes spit had been but a desolate lick of dirt. The rise of the wicked city was as explosive as its sudden downfall in 1692, when earth and ocean swallowed it whole, as if truly by divine intervention. And in this video, we shall learn all about it. May God help us all. Jamaica's southeastern coast buckles inward to form a large bay called Kingston Harbour, and out from its eastern end juts a slender peninsula called the Palisadoes Spit. Rather than being a continuous strip of land, the spit is a series of cays or small islands, filled in between by sand and gravel brought in from the rivers of Jamaica. These soft foundations place the spit at the mercy of natural disasters. Earthquakes that might carry the silt off into the sea, separating the cays from one another. The first visitors of the spit were the Taino Indians, inhabitants of Jamaica. Fish and shellfish are abundant around the spit, and were surely visited by Taino canoes, and they may even have constructed a small settlement. Archaeological findings include pottery shards and a metate, a large stone with two legs, used for grinding corn. It is unlikely that fishermen would have brought it with them, and frequent natural disasters may have erased any trace of a native settlement. Whether the Taino lived here permanently or not, they did have a name for the spit: Cagway. There is a wild theory out there that Cagway was visited by the Romans. In the 1950s, archaeologists recovered a marble pedestal from the 1st century AD, inscribed with Latin text. Could it have been carried by a Roman galley, waylaid across the Great Atlantic? Owing to the lack of supporting evidence, such as a Roman shipwreck or additional artifacts, it is more likely that the pedestal had been carried as ballast aboard a Spanish explorer and dropped in the Cagway waters during the days of Columbus. This intrepid Italian discovered Jamaica in 1494, and by 1509, his honorable son Diego had been granted a permit to colonize. He and his settlers showed a scarce interest in Cagwa, or Cagwaya as they called it. Their main naval base was at Old Harbor Bay, but the westernmost of the cays was used for careening. This was a process in which a ship was tipped on its side to expose the part of the hull normally below the waterline. Time would see it infested with barnacles, seaweed, and shipworms, all slowing the ship down or eating away at the wood, obliging their removal by burning and scraping. The damaged wood was then replaced and painted over with a protective and repelling layer. The Spanish saw the New World as their God-given property, and harbored no intention of permitting the other European powers. All external trade and colonization was banned. This was quite bothersome for, well, literally everyone, not only because they had a hankering for exotic goods like sugar, dyes, and cacao, but Europe was suffering a general shortage of gold and silver, which the New World was abundant in. Spanish trade policy and a high demand for their New World goods made their rivals turn to alternate methods of acquiring those goods. Piracy, but also smuggling. Smuggling, that is, illegal, unlicensed commerce, was actually mutually beneficial to Spain's rivals and, believe it or not, Spain's colonies. The home country lacked the industry to properly supply her settlers with everyday items such as cloth and hardware, giving the smugglers an edge in the targeted market. English colonial policy was largely left in the hands of private persons. Entrepreneurs, dashing sea captains, roguish merchants, at least until 1655, when Oliver Cromwell dispatched a fleet to carve out a small colonial empire. His Puritan class of traders wanted a reliable post to sell contraband to the Spanish colonies, whereas Cromwell himself wanted a naval base from which to attack and plunder Spain's galleons. The galleons was a convoy that traveled annually between Spain and America, delivering trade items to and fro. Most importantly, they returned home with a literal boatload of gold and silver. Cromwell's expedition ended in disaster, with almost half of the transported army perishing from sickness on the island of Hispaniola. Not wishing to disappoint the Lord Protector and risk their heads, the commanders targeted Jamaica instead. When the sun rose on the 10th of May, 1655, the fleet entered Kingston Harbor. They were being advised by an old pirate. He had participated in a raid against Jamaica some 12 years prior, and he piloted them around the shallows of the Cagway Spit. Otherwise, the ships might have run aground. The fleet dropped anchor and landed troops on the Spit, occupying the Spanish fort after a token resistance. The capture was emblematic of the campaign that remained. Jamaica was sparsely inhabited, and the English were able to take it without much of a fight. Having completed their mission of acquiring a colony, the army hunkered down and prepared to fortify, unaware of the drawn-out struggle that awaited. Indeed, the Spanish had released their slaves and issued them weaponry, starting a guerrilla war that would continue until the next century. These guerrillas, known as the Maroons, knew the wild terrain of Jamaica better than the English. They were able to strike patrols and minor settlements to great effect, and along with starvation, disease, and desertion, the English numbers plummeted. Even the two expedition leaders feared for their health and ran back to London, where Cromwell had them imprisoned. The initial landing force of 7,000 had soon been reduced to 2,600, and the English capital at Spanish Town, Villa de la Vega, was successfully raided and burned. It soon became apparent that the English needed a good base, somewhere defensible and healthy. The spit of Cagway Bay, known to the English as Cagway or simply the Point, began to look promising. For one, it was highly defensible, since the guerrillas would have to press through a narrow strip, susceptible to fire from the fort and ships in the harbor. It was also considered healthy, since the lack of rainfall made it dry and void of mosquitoes, the primary source of malady. The utility of the point was recognized shortly after the initial landing, when General Venables ordered the construction of blockhouses, a habitation for the garrison. 2 months later, limestone was ferried from a quarry across the bay, and used to construct Fort Cromwell. It was a stone tower surrounded by earthworks, mounted with cannons taken from the ships. It was also used as a prison. In 1660, it housed a pirate named Peter Swain, arrested after robbing a shallop from Barbados. We can see it depicted on a map drawn by a Spanish spy in 1657. At the narrow point of the peninsula, the English constructed a line of defensive palisades, sturdy enough to keep out the attackers, but with a gate to allow the citizens entry. These were simply called the palisadoes, and would bestow their name to the entirety of the spit. Later on, an airport. The hamlet expanded just north of Fort Cromwell, starting out as a number of huts, residences, and warehouses. The early inhabitants were primarily soldiers, most of whom shunned honest work, and the first trickle of civilians were all attached to the administration. The first semblance to an alehouse was likely opened by George and John Evans, when they were granted a sutler's license in April of 56, allowing them to sell provisions and liquor. They got their goods from the occasional supply ship, but a lot of trade was also carried out by navy ships, even though it was actually forbidden. By 1657, the region had been consolidated enough to allow the entry of civilians and merchants, and the point soon became Jamaica's official port of commerce. Most of the early trade concerned the supply of the military. The government constructed storehouses, the commander's residence, and in 1658, a church. Land grants were given for private individuals to construct their timber-framed houses. Most of the early grants were given to sea captains, merchants, and military figures, but by 1660 they were commonly given to humbler persons, such as a carpenter and a cooper. This was the beginning of Port Royal's flourishing urban community. Some building materials could be taken from the ships. Barrel staves were repurposed into roof shingles, for example, and the town possessed a state-owned smithy. However, most materials, like stone and brick, had to be brought from the mainland. The point lacked any natural resources, and the aforementioned dryness meant that water also had to be imported. The hamlet possessed a small fleet for this purpose, consisting of a shallop, a galliot, a hoy, and 2 piraguas. And for the rest of its existence, fresh water would typically arrive every morning, though some would also collect rainwater in backyard cisterns. Cagway's primary purpose would be as a naval station for the English fleet, and it would be considered one of the best harbors in the New World. The spit served as a windbreak against the Caribbean Sea, shielding the vessels anchored in the harbor. They could easily beach and repair on one of the quays, with Chocolate Hole, this deep bay on the westernmost tip of the spit, becoming especially common for careening and ship maintenance. Cagway and Jamaica as a whole lay right in the center of the Caribbean, and ideally situated to wage maritime war on the Spanish colonies, or to carry out contraband trade. On the flip side, it also made her vulnerable to counterattacks. The settlement's survival and prosperity was therefore dependent on a strong fleet, but after the invasion of 1655, more and more ships were recalled to England, either out of strategic or maintenance concerns. By 1656, less than 10 remained out of the initial 30. Vice Admiral William Goodson decided not to rest on his laurels, but took to the offensive. In August of 1655, he assaulted Santa Marta near Cartagena, and although he could not reap a significant profit, he did acquire 32 cannons for the point's defense, and established an aggressive trend in Jamaican strategy. Some would call it piracy. He repeated his campaign in 57, taking a number of prize ships. Though Governor Doyley seemed initially apprehensive about Goodson's strategy, he definitely came over to his side by 57, even taking his policy to the next level. Deciding that the English fleet wasn't enough, he reached out to the Brethren of the Coast, a coalition of multinational pirates and hunters on the Hispaniola coast. The isolated rock of Tortuga had long served as their base, and although it was highly defensible, its rugged terrain made it less suitable as a harbor. Cagway seemed preferable, and Doyle lured the buccaneers with promises of victuals and commissions. These were mercenary contracts permitting the robbery of Spanish ships. The brethren received a good harbor, a market for plunder, and access to provisions and amenities. In return, Doyle received naval defense and an early boost to the economy. A number of their transactions have been preserved. In 1659, Doyle bought a prize ship from the pirates, the Angel Gabriel, incorporating her into the Jamaica fleet. In May of the same year, an English ship named the New Garden was sold to a French pirate, Monsieur Le Pen. Le Pen also traded a cargo of hides and rosin for a load of cacao beans. Hard cash was still rare at this point, and goods used instead of specie. In another instance of Doyle's support for piracy, a Spanish prize captured by the Navy was sold at auction to Captain Maurice Williams. Williams was immediately given a privateering commission, and Doyle proclaimed that naval sailors and soldiers were allowed to join his crew. Normally, the Navy was apprehensive about letting their sailors loose, especially to privateers. The prize court was crucial to Cagway's operation as a pirate base, and operated without approval from the Admiralty back home. Their process was remarkably simple. When the captured prize was brought into the harbor, it was received by the prize officer, along with evidence of its legal capture. Prime evidence was the presence of the ship's legal owner, who could protest the legality of the capture. Naturally, these owners usually failed to make it. The prizes were then presented to Governor Doyle, who had to approve them as legal. It was then publicly sold on auction by inch of candle. Buyers called out their price, and the highest bid was marked an inch down on a candle. The candle was then lit and allowed to burn until a higher bid was announced. If the candle burned below the highest bid, the candle was extinguished, and the prize ship sold. By the early 1660s, Doyle began to see the consequences of his sponsorship. In the long term, the Buccaneers drew away much-needed labor from the plantations, with the former soldiers, destitute settlers, and indentured servants preferring not to break their backs on manual labor, but the high-risk, high-reward lifestyle offered by buccaneering. Doyle remarked how the alehouses benefited most, since the freebooters spent most of their shares on liquor and women. It drove them into heavy debt, and many went to sea purely to satisfy their credit. This often led them to attacking fellow Englishmen, and some feared returning home, further depriving the labor market and island's defense. Doyle ordered out pirate hunters to deal with the renegades, and in 1660 ordered a flat-out cessation of any and all privateering. This order came straight from the new government. After the death of Oliver Cromwell in 1658, faith in England's Republican experiment had all but vanished, and it was decided to restore the monarchy, bestowing the crown to Charles II. It was kind of awkward in Jamaica to have a castle named Cromwell, you know, the guy who decapitated the new king's father, so in the records the name was just slowly replaced with Fort Charles. To likewise honor the new ruler, Cagway was renamed Port Royal. As for why Charlie wanted to end privateering, he had actually spent much of his exile in the court of Spain, and saw no better way to pay them back than with peace, and so recalled the Buccaneers' commissions. The order was largely ignored, since most Jamaicans benefited so heavily from the privateers, even if they weren't privateers themselves. Plantationers bought slaves from them, merchants their plunder, and the local businesses sold them booze, prostitutes, and goods at outrageous prices. Only now did Doyle realize the gravity of his choices, but if he was hoping for any sign of stopping, it wasn't to be seen. In 1662, Doyle was replaced by Lord Windsor, a man who attempted trade with the Spanish colonies. Opposition from Port Royal and hostility from the Spanish ended these attempts quite quickly, and he turned to Commodore Christopher Minks, the local naval commander, to present a solution. Minks mustered the Buccaneers and went on a privateering cruise to Cuba and Campeche, amassing significant loot. The Spanish complained to London about Mynx's attacks, and although Charlie ordered another cessation of hostility, it, again, had no effect. By 1663, there were 22 full-time privateering crafts active in Port Royal. Governors had come and gone quite rapidly at this point, and in 64, the flux ended with the entrance of Sir Thomas Modiford. Although given the express order not to issue any further commissions, Modiford would blatantly ignore it and kickstart the golden age of buccaneering. The reasons for it were provided in a letter by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lynch. Naked orders to restrain them or call them in will teach them only to keep out of this port and force them, it may be, to prey on us as well as the Spaniards. Lynch went on to explain that a repeal of commissions would only chase them off to England's rivals. And Modiford not only found the Buccaneers crucial to Jamaica's economic prosperity, but especially her defense. Despite his official repeals of commissions, pleas with Spanish governors for friendship, and token executions of pirates, Buccaneers continued their sale of prizes at Port Royal, now at an exponential rate. These depredations reached a new height through Modiford's alliance with Henry Morgan. Morgan had risen through the ranks of Christopher Mynx to become a successful captain in his own right, eventually buying a plantation and marrying into Jamaican high society. It was at this point that Modiford appointed Morgan as the new admiral of the Jamaican Navy, sending him on aggressive campaigns against targets of strategic interest. Although Modiford wanted to gather intelligence and destroy Spanish mustering points, targets that could actively threaten the English colony, Morgan would often defy these orders and attack places based on their sheer value. He assaulted places like Portobello and Maracaibo, which did not pose any threat, but were certainly rich. Modiford wasn't exactly pleased by this, but it is uncertain if Morgan was entirely to blame either. His men, the unruly Buccaneers, could not be satisfied by victory for victory's sake, nor were they paid in set wages, not like the government could afford it, but from what they could plunder. The more they took, the happier they were. Therefore, both Morgan and Modiford had to tolerate this morally dubious decision if they wanted to secure their own interests. Of course, it naturally didn't hurt that both of them profited from it immensely. Here is required an explanation of Port Royal's economic model. The Buccaneers went out and robbed from Spanish ships and colonies, taking with them gold, silver, slaves, and various goods. Merchants then bought these items from the Buccaneers at very low rates. These items were afterwards smuggled back into the Spanish colonies or shipped overseas to London, where they were sold at a much higher price. The profit allowed the merchants to buy more items from the pirates or even invested into the sugar plantations of the island. Merchants stood much to benefit, and there is one charming instance of Modiford's own son, James, complaining that he lacked any funds to buy from the Buccaneers. He wrote the following: "To let you have the enclosed relation concerning the privateers' expedition to Porto Principe and Portobello. For the latter place I am confident they brought more plunder in jewels, gold and silver standard than twice the value of the ransom they had for the place, and I might have bought what I would almost at 40 shilling per ounce gold, and silver from 2 shillings $6 to 3 per ounce, but I was not in cash here." The Buccaneers' money typically re-entered Port Royal's circulation. The captains bought repair materials, provisions, weapons and ammunition to ready their next expeditions, and their men indulged in the goods and services offered by the booming polis. Port Royal was a Caribbean exception in that it was a town where free artisans and craftsmen flourished. In other colonies, they typically competed against enslaved artisans, driving down their wages. Port Royal harbored shoemakers, tailors, gunsmiths, barbers, bakers, carpenters, comb makers, goldsmiths, hat makers, besides the vast array of victuallers, vintners, and tavern keepers. Between 1663 and 1685, there were at least 44 of these registered. Captain Waldeck of Barbados liked to say that the first thing the Spanish did when making a new settlement was to build a church, the Dutch a fort, the English a drinking house. This was definitely true in Port Royal. and in 1661, 40 new licenses were handed out in July alone. Most of these places were likely just stalls or even rooms rented in larger buildings. Many of these places were unnamed, but the deeds have recorded at least 18 proper taverns between 1665 and 1685. Their names are quite colourful. My own favourites are the Black Dog, the Blue Anchor, the Cheshire Cheese, the Green Dragon, the Sign of Bacchus, and the Sign of the Mermaid. We have some knowledge of what these taverns could have looked like, based, for example, on a description of the unnamed tavern owned by Mr. Thomas Taylor, described upon his death in November of 1674. The tavern consisted of 5 rooms and a cellar, each of them given a unique name. First was the Vin Room, containing a large wooden chest, a sign, a striped carpet, and an old saddle. The Queen's Head had a bed, a bedstead, and similar furnishings. It might be where Mr. Taylor slept, or where women of the establishment may have entertained the guests. The bar room had 2 punch bowls, 2 earthen pots, and a silver dram cup. The Nag's Head seems to have been an eating room, being furnished with a copper pot, a table, and 2 old guns for decoration. A room called the Rose had a table, green curtains, and a trunk full of old clothes. The King's Head seems to have been the largest room, having stools, leather chairs, hammocks, a large number of cooking utensils, and a servant designated to it. Finally, the cellar was full of brandy, claret, Madera wine, and candles. Taylor's tavern must have been popular, and he seems to have served patrons on generous credit. A list of his debtors contained 52 persons, including 4 doctors and a barber. Judging by the utensils, it seems he served both drink and food. For any foodies out there, Jamaica must have been worth the visit. Far-flung trade routes gave the denizens access to a vast array of delicacies, with fruits, veggies, meats and fish imported from Europe and the North American colonies. Beef and pork was typically local, shipped from the mainland across the harbour and slaughtered in the morning. It was then sold at the market and cooked almost immediately, lest it rot with a lack of refrigeration. Turtles were a local delicacy, taken from the local islands and kept in special turtle kraals on High Street, before being taken out and butchered. The only product of poor quality was the bread. Although there was at least one baker, the flour was imported from overseas, usually stale, and the bread reportedly not well relished. More favorable were the number of sweets, including cheesecakes, custards, and tarts. Naturally, the Buccaneers liked to indulge in less wholesome activities. Gambling was one of them. Large sums of money were wasted on dice, cards, and gaming tables. A more violent sort of game were the many cockfights, either hosted in the streets or at one of the establishments. One of them was the so-called bear garden, where patrons could watch fights between a bear and a bull. Ulysses would love it. A more peaceful activity, albeit with a martial undertone, was shooting at the target, and many establishments had a billiard table and room. Billiard back in the day was a bit different from nowadays, being slightly reminiscent of modern mini-golf since they used a kind of club. Music was likely ubiquitous to the taverns, and a visitor named John Taylor mentioned how the young sparks of the common sort would nightly resort to the music houses. Dancing was no doubt popular. Gambling and gaming was no doubt accompanied by a pipe or 2 of bacca, and archaeology proves that the city suffered from nothing less than a smoking epidemic. Excavations have uncovered as many as 5,000 clay pipes. It was common for a smoker to own several pipes, since they had to be cooled after each session, and they would often leave these pipes in their favorite tavern. Most of them were imported, but the slaves would make their own pipes from local red clay, marking it with geometric patterns, and by 1680, there was one pipe maker active in the town. Smoking was not only common with the lads, but the lassies too. A visitor described the common women of the town as follows. In their smocks or linen petticoats, barefooted without shoes or stockings, with a straw hat and red tobacco pipe in their mouths, trampoos about their streets in this their warlike posture, and thus a raid will booze a cup of punch comely with anyone. Yeah, I know you boys are thirsting for those barefooted Port Royal wenches. These were surely the sorts of girls that mingled with the Buccaneers, and who bereaved them of plenty a penning. If a bucket desired female company, the town was not short of it. The colonies had a general lack of the opposite sex, a trend broken by Port Royal, in which there was a remarkable parity between men and women. Some of them owned businesses, either alone or together with a husband. Many were maids and servants to the merchant class, most of them indentured, and many were employed as prostitutes. The largest brothel in Port Royal's history was operated by John Starr. According to a census from 1680, he maintained an establishment of 21 white women and 2 black. The most infamous prostitute did not arrive until 1671, just at the end of Port Royal's buccaneering heyday. Her name was Mary Carleton. Born in Canterbury around 1634, she spent her teenage years as a criminal before becoming a stage actress, even having a play written specifically for her, The German Princess. This became her nickname. After years of engaging in fraud, she was arrested in 71 for theft and bigamy, transported for life to Jamaica. Here she spent a single scandalous year in Port Royal, with one person describing her as common as a barber's chair. No sooner was one out, but another was in. She escaped back to England in 72, but was arrested the following year and hanged at Tyburn. Her life inspired a slew of sleazy literature. Together with these loose and lurid women, the Buccaneers engaged in the greatest vice of Port Royal: alcoholism. The spirits on offer were abundant and near endless. Naturally, there were non-alcoholic beverages, such as water, lemonades, and hot chocolate, though the alcoholic sorts were more preferred. From Europe came beer, cider, brandy, and wines of all sorts, many undoubtedly robbed from the Spanish colonies. There was a local spirit called Moby, made from boiling potatoes and straining the mash. Of course, the cheapest and most common of the local drinks was rum bullion, now called rum, and not inappropriately nicknamed Kill Devil. Made from local sugar, it was much stronger than a modern variety, and liable to knock you out cold. Modiford reported the following: "The Spaniards wondered much at the sickness of our people, until they knew the strength of their drinks. But then they wondered more that they were not all dead." Modiford and the monarchy both realized that a profit could be made from the Buccaneers' expenditure. Charles II issued a royal monopoly on the sale of brandy, with the revenue being used to improve the town's fortifications. Fort Charles grew into a proper castle, and additional ones were built. Modiford himself instituted a small tax on all liquor, drawing in significant revenue. Rum was not inappropriately nicknamed Kill Devil, as it was often a source of literal death. One of the most common diseases was a malady called the dry gripes. No one back then knew what caused it, but nowadays it has been concluded that it was caused by the excessive consumption of rum, which was distilled in lead pipes. Dry gripes was essentially lead poisoning. Before the rum could kill the pirates, their sponging off it would usually result in episodes that strongly contributed to the point's wicked reputation. After receiving their shares of plunder, the Buccaneers would swarm the shoemakers, tailors, and hatmakers for new suits of clothes, before descending into the taverns and brothels, feasting on the bounties of grub, pickling their guts, one hand holding a buxom babe and the other casting dice. They might spend thousands of doubloons in a single night. One man offered a woman 500 pieces of 8 just to see her naked, and they often woke up with no money left for breakfast. This is why so many of them ended up in debt, despite making fortunes many times the average salary. One of the biggest contributors to the town's reputation was a notorious pirate named Roque Brasiliano. Being accompanied by a large party of followers, the authorities could do little about his shenanigans. He would chase after people with a drawn cutlass, throw beer at them, and when he felt sociable, he'd buy an entire barrel of wine, obliging anyone that passed to drink. You didn't really have a choice, because he did it at the point of a pistol. According to a Dutch explorer, even the parrots of the city would sit down and chug from such barrels of wine and ale. Fighting and spontaneous duels were common, and the riotous nature of the city soon forced Modifer to move his residence to the mainland, and the governor's house in Port Royal soon fell into disrepair, only being used on formal occasions. It has also been debated if the town truly benefited from the Buccaneers and their spending, especially in the long term. Though local businesses did profit from their activities, most of the money earned from the sale of plunder ultimately went to London. Not to the state, but the merchants operating there. On average, a Port Royal merchant was worth £10,000, whereas the Greater London merchants accumulated nearly 20,000. The richest Port Royal merchant, Daniel Hicks, did not make his money from plunder, but from manufacturing clay pots used in the refining of sugar. In the 1660s, plunder was the moneymaker of the burgeoning port. 1/5 of its population were actively involved in the privateer's trade, but this destructive trend seemed about to shift. In 1671, Henry Morgan sacked the city of Panama, leading to an international crisis and the arrests of him and Modiford. Spain and England had agreed to a new treaty, Jamaica recognized as English, and all forms of hostility were to cease. Sir Thomas Lynch was appointed as the new governor, and he intended to not only reform the economy to a more peaceful model, but also the moral standing of Port Royal. Gambling was one of the first targets. Lynch instituted a fine of £10 on anyone that permitted gaming under their roof. Gamblers had to forfeit their earnings and pay a fine, whereas cheaters, including those using loaded dice, faced additional charges. The losers were recompensed, including those who betted on the wrong player. Drinking, whoring, music and cockfights could still be enjoyed, but Port Royal also offered more genteel establishments. Lynch's French secretary, Charles de la Barre, operated a tavern known for its cream tarts and syllabub. This was a sort of custard, made by curdling milk or cream with wine or cider, whipping, and solidifying it with gelatin. Port Royal had grown exponentially from its humble beginnings. By 1660 there were 200 houses, 4 years later 400. The population in 62 numbered 400 freemen, 200 women, 90 children, and 50 slaves, a total of 740. 10 years later, they numbered a total of 2,181, distributed between 800 houses. We have a general understanding of what these buildings looked like. They were not only small houses, but large ones as tall as 4 stories. A house might be entirely occupied by a single family, or partially or wholly rented out, often room by room. Rent was very high, comparable to the finer districts in London, and included usage of the yard, cookroom, well, and shade. An outdoor awning used to provide, well, shade, for the sake of cooling in the hot weather. Although an important feature of the early houses, the lack of space made them gradually disappear in the 70s and 80s. All of the houses lacked chimneys, and cooking was done in a separate building in the yard, the cookroom. This was usually a small brick building with a chimney, hearth, sometimes an oven, and a number of cooking utensils. The yard would also hold a latrine, called the House of Office, washtubs, and many were furnished with a brick cistern for collecting rainwater. All of them were chaotically mixed together, for the city had grown organically and out of private interests, rather than state-organized planning and initiative. The only real structure came from the well-laid-out streets, these being as wide as 30 feet. Only the parade ground near the Palisadoes Gate had been paved, and the remaining streets were surfaced with sand, a constant nuisance to the housewives, since the winds of the sea would blow up little dust storms and send the grains flinging into the buildings. Sweeping must have been a daily activity. By modern standards, Port Royal wasn't big, about 54.5 football fields, but it was the biggest English settlement of the New World, and had to be crammed into the small space of the tiny quay. Shops, residences, and taverns cramped together on every square foot, and in the 1670s onwards, the shoals on the waterfront were reclaimed. The reclaimed land was used to construct private wharves for the large ships, and additional space for warehouses. The result was a very traditional-looking English town, perched upon the end of a sandy spit against the tropical background of the blue Jamaican mountains. The population primarily came from England, Ireland and Scotland, but people flocked from all over the world. In a century of religious hatred and dispute, Port Royal was surprisingly tolerant, and housed peoples of creeds elsewhere shunned. There was St. Paul's Anglican Church, a Presbyterian, a meeting house for Quakers, a Catholic chapel, many of the French Buccaneers were Catholics, and even a Jewish synagogue. Judaism has a long history on Jamaica, many of them having moved there during the Spanish period, and they gladly accepted the English overlordship owing to the pro-Jewish tolerance offered by Cromwell and Charles II both. That is not to say that the Jews did not face critique, since their prosperous merchant community posed an apparent threat to the Christian merchants, who were trying their best to oust them. In 1692, they wrote the following to the Lords of Trade. "The Jews eat us and our children out of all trade. We did not want them at Port Royal, a place populous and strong without them. And though told that the whole country lay open to them, they have made Port Royal their Goshen, and will do nothing but trade. When the Assembly tries to tax them more heavily than Christians, who are subject to public duties from which they are exempt, they contrive to evade it by special favors. This is a great and growing evil, and had we not warning from other colonies, we should see our streets filled and the ships hither crowded with them. This means taking our children's bread and giving it to Jews." Furthermore, a great many Jews worked as moneylenders, a disliked profession, and a great many buccaneers undoubtedly owed them money for their excessive habits. Also being skilled jewelers, they were accused of clipping coins, that is, literally clipping away the edges of coins to melt down or use as payment, enriching yourself while devaluing the natural worth of the money. They were also accused of corruption. When a new governor was inaugurated, it was customary for them to offer him a so-called Jew pie. It was a pie crust covering a large purse of gold doubloons. "Could I have that with some whipped cream?" Indeed, the governors were heavily dependent on the Jewish community for its trade connections. The diaspora had created a worldwide Jewish community that connected Jamaican Jews with far-flung mercantile contacts. Since so many of the Jamaican Jews had Iberian origins and spoke Spanish or Portuguese, they were an invaluable asset in the contraband trade with the Spanish colonies, which Lynch sought to bolster. Lynch's ambition was to replace the island's dependency on buccaneering with smuggling, and Port Royal served as the perfect hub for this profitable trade network, all under the governor's diligent oversight. Gone were the days when any ship could just arrive and do what it pleased. Any new arrival had to anchor at the harbor and be inspected by the clerk of the Navy office, who examined the ship's entries, dispatches, loadings, and passengers to make sure that England's navigation acts were followed to a T. This was a law that, ironically, sought to hinder unauthorized trade. There were 3 categories of ships that arrived in Port Royal. The biggest vessels were typically merchantmen. They were allowed to anchor close in the harbor or even at the docks. These carried products from Europe. Smaller vessels from North America carried staples from their plantations, often ship stores, and the smallest boats were used for local trade, usually smuggling. These were nominally relegated to Chocolate Hole, and ubiquitous among them was the Jamaica sloop. This was a rakish vessel that became so prevalent as to call the contraband trade the sloop trade, its sailors sloopmen. These lads were also engaged in logwooding, the harvest of dyewoods in modern-day Mexico. This was also illegal, since it occurred on Spanish property, and most of the logwood cutters were retired buccaneers. Indeed, Lynch made considerable efforts to crack down on their old activities, but most of his policies ended up in failure. After the Spanish made several threats of invasion, he tried to fortify the island on credit and keep the buccaneers close as an auxiliary defense. But after he executed several pirates, he only succeeded in scaring them off. War broke out with the Dutch, and now he lacked privateers for the island's defense. England refused him support, and since he was unpopular with the council, they refused him any money to improve the situation. Meanwhile in London, Henry Morgan had become so popular with the upper class as to be granted an audience with Charles II. The king asked for Morgan's advice on how to defend Jamaica, and being so impressed by the old admiral's ideas, decided to institute him as lieutenant governor. Lynch was promptly deposed and replaced by Governor Vaughan. While waiting for Vaughan's arrival, Morgan began the process of fortifying Port Royal. Basing the improvements on his own experiences with siege warfare, plundering Spanish towns, his first completion was Fort Rupert, a 22-gun line of stone at the old Palisadoes. The 14-gun Fort Carlisle was built on the northern tip, and a battery of 16 guns just east of Old Fort Charles, called Morgan's Line. By 1680, Morgan's project had been completed, with Port Royal surrounded by a ring of forts, altogether armed with 100 guns, and a militia of 2,500 men. No mortal army could take the city on. Whilst he was fortifying Port Royal, Morgan had no intentions of easing the previous reliance on buccaneers, and throughout the 1670s and 80s, the town would continue its conduct with privateers and pirates. Though the government had taken a hardline stance against them, Charles II himself admitted to the Spanish ambassador that Jamaica's harboring of pirates was a difficult contagion to cure. Morgan was frequently accused of making private dealings with the scoundrels, inviting them to his home and recommending them to the neighboring French. Though England was at peace with Spain, France wasn't, meaning that English privateers could get legal commissions from the French, pirate from the Spanish, but then sell their plunder at Port Royal. However, piracy was strictly illegal, as was sailing under foreign commissions, so this trade had to be done with more secrecy. In some cases, the traders ventured out of Port Royal, seeking out the pirates to either sell them goods, usually alcohol, or buy plunder from them. Much of this illegal trade never appeared in the records, since it went undocumented. Merchant William Hall wrote the following: "As padlocks upon people's mouths are convenient at this time, so do I put it upon my pen." One clue to the continued prevalence of buccaneer trade are the many gold and silversmiths active in Port Royal during the 70s and 80s. Gold and silver coins could easily be traced as pirate plunder, but the smiths could melt and process them into cutlery, chandeliers, and jewelry, essentially as a form of money laundry. Another hint are the great many surgeons operating in the city, even outnumbering the coopers. This implies that it was more profitable to treat wounded men, likely from combat, than it was to make barrels. Another common enough profession were cool-makers and others who carved ivory. The tusk of elephants, they were commonly carried on slave ships freshly arrived from Africa. Many of these traders were illegal, and many of them were likewise taken by pirates operating out of Port Royal. The great number of ivory carvers indicates the prevalence of both the legal and illegal slave trade. In other cases, Morgan did not have much of a choice but to permit the pirates. In 1677, a fleet of 6 heavily armed ships entered Port Royal after sacking Santa Marta, looking to dispose of their plunder. Since the fortifications were still being erected, he did not have sufficient power to actually stop them, even if he or anyone in the port actually wanted to. Since France was posing a serious threat to Jamaica in the late 1670s, the governor also wanted to encourage the buccaneers' presence, and so tolerated the piracies of captains like Coxon, Sharp, Essex, Allison, Rowe, and Maggot, all of whom anchored their ships in Port Royal and sold their plunder. When the governor departed in 1680, Morgan effectively became the island's ruler, and he instituted a more hardline policy against his former companions. This might seem like a betrayal, but it was caused by a shift of interest. And as always, economics were the reason. Morgan had been a privateer, sure, but early on in his career he invested his plunder into his sugar estate and became a firmly entrenched member of the local aristocracy. The plantation economy had become so developed at this point as to become seriously profitable, and piracy hampered the island's ability to export, and thus the prosperity of Morgan, his friends and family. And though piracy was a means to acquire goods for the merchants, it also hampered their illicit but peaceful trade with the Spanish. As a result, these two classes banded together against the pirates, mostly at the expense of the small businesses, who seem to have benefited most from direct pirate interactions. It is ironic, because the merchant class essentially shot themselves in the feet. Their presence in Port Royal was also a roadblock to the planters, since they served as a pestering middleman in the export of sugar. If the planters could get rid of them, they could export their sugar themselves and make more money. Another economic question was that of slaves. Buccaneering had hampered the sugar industry by stealing away white laborers from the plantations and onto the ships, and one of the solutions was simply to import more African slaves. However, the pirates also captured slaves and sold them in Port Royal at a very cheap rate, either bought by the labor-starved planters or the smugglers, who sold them on to the Spanish. The Spanish became so reliant on buying slaves from the English that an agent of the Hacienda set up an office in Port Royal in 1689, I think. The Hacienda was a Spanish contract that ensured the importation of slaves to their colonies, since Spain did not conduct any African trade themselves. The unlicensed trade of slaves was popular both with the merchants and the planters. The only ones who disliked it were the Royal African Company, who held a monopoly on the English slave trade. Some of the governors held shares in or worked as agents of the company. As for Morgan, he did not start cracking down on the illegal slave trade until the mid-1680s, when the Duke of York was destined to become the new king. He held a majority share in the company, and Morgan wanted to butter up. Port Royal became increasingly hostile towards pirates, and many of them met their end at its gallows. Several Royal Navy vessels were deployed to Port Royal for the express purpose of pirate hunting. These were light frigates, well suited for chase and combat, manned by well-trained crews capable of taking the buccaneers on. These ships were combined with one or two galleys, capable of pursuing their chase into shallow waters. Most of the pirates escaped, but the slave-trading interlopers were easier to catch. They had smaller crews, were lightly armed, and it took time for them to unload their human cargoes in the hidden crooks and crevices of the Jamaican coast, rendering them susceptible to surprise assaults. Of course, these slaves weren't liberated as much as they came under new management. One of the most remarkable pirates of this era was Joseph Bannister, a merchant down on his luck who tried to get a corsairing commission from the French. Oddly enough, they actually refused him, and Bannister was caught by the Navy ship Ruby. At his trial, the jury could never come to a conclusion, giving Bannister time to escape. Since Bannister outgunned the Royal Navy ships, the new governor contended to just send him a stern letter, telling Bannister that he'd be treated as a pirate should he return. Bannister said that he had no intentions of piracy. Sure. The months passed, with constant reports of, what a surprise, Bannister pirating ships. The Navy was sent out again, and managed to corner the pirate as he lay careening his ship at Samana. He had set up fortifications and managed to beat the Navy to a standstill, though his flagship was so badly beaten that she had to be burned. Bannister escaped, but was eventually caught, and hanged from the yardarm of the Navy frigate. The captain had feared the indecision of another trial and jury, and didn't want Bannister to escape again. Port Royal had turned a new leaf, at least on the surface, and illicit activities, ranging from the piratical to the slaving, continued beneath the respectable veneer. In the year of our Lord, 1692, Dr. Edmund Halley discovered a new comet soaring across the starlit sky, naming it Halley's Comet. When the comet was sighted again in 1762, it heralded the destruction of Lisbon, Portugal. So too had it, upon its initial sighting in 92, foretold the destruction of Port Royal, Sodom of the New World. A certain astrologer had arrived 6 years prior, predicting a coming earthquake and that The point should be swallowed up by the sea. When the rains came in May, doomsayers took to the streets, begging the residents of this wicked city to confess their sins before the Father, but they were not listened to, and the rains fell. Port Royal had signed its own death warrant. The Spanish and Taino before them knew well the dangers of the point, and the frequency of natural calamities. Their buildings were raised low to the ground, with deep, central foundations, resistant to the shifting soils and loose masses of sand. The point had been avoided, since the ground primarily consisted of soft foundations, easily liquefied in the case of disaster. But the English disliked foreign know-how. They settled the point for its defensibility. Its favorable position as a commercial hub, money came first, money and sin. Here they built their houses tall of brick and stone, as if to raise a stairwell to heaven and point their finger at those astral vaults, and for this they would pay, and payment was long overdue. Tuesday morning, on the 7th of June, 1692, seemed like an ordinary day in Port Royal. Red-coat militiamen patrolled the walls of the stone forts, naked eyes open for French warships. War had broken out between the old allies, ending the decades of cooperation between the French and English buccaneers. Dozens of merchant ships lay in the harbor, one of her recently arrived crews sleeping off last night's excesses. The taverns opened early, as did the church, and the Anglican minister, Dr. Emmanuel Heath, remarked how I had been at church reading prayers to keep some show of religion to a most ungodly, debauched people. Church attendance in Port Royal had always been low. At 11:30 a.m., the ground started to rumble. Earthquakes were nothing out of the ordinary, so no one really cared about it. The new arrivals were assured that it would soon be over. It didn't go over. Instead, the earthquake intensified. The initial tremor was followed by a series of intensive shocks, and a sound like matches striking brimstone. The ground shuddered and rose in waves, and the steeple of St. Paul's Church toppled and fell in a massive cloud of dust, its bell hitting the ground and striking a final, ominous toll. The rest of the church fell within seconds. Panic spread across the city. People took to the street, running everywhere, regardless of creed or class or color. A splintering sound emanated from the ground, joined by wailing, crying, sobbing, whilst others simply stood frozen, uncertain how to react. At the waterfront, the soft foundations liquefied in an instant, taking the quayside and surrounding streets 40 feet into the ocean. Entire buildings as tall as 4 stories just swallowed whole, some rooftops visible still above the surface. In one of the houses, the wife of the affluent merchant, Samuel Bernard, was 2 stories high in the closet, with her daughter and maid. As the ground lurched beneath them, she ordered the maid upstairs, and was trapped with her child. When the maid rushed back downstairs, the sea rushed upwards to meet her. Somehow, she survived. Everyone else in the building, at least 6, drowned. Emmanuel Heath was running for his life, the streets and houses collapsing around him, bricks rolling over his shoes, the earth swallowing up entire crowds of screaming people. A merchant who had been enjoying his morning drink just a minute ago fled besides him, seeing the streets rise like waves, lifting up the people standing there and casting them down into pits. People struggled to stand, and whole rivers spouted from the cavities, accompanied by the foulest of stenches. Ships moored in the harbor came crashing into the city like driftwood, breaking against each other or the buildings. Well above their heads, the sky had turned dull and red like a hot oven. To the east, the land at the narrowest point of the Palisadoes turned to liquid, cutting Port Royal off from the mainland. The defenses were utterly ruined, Fort Rupert submerged, and the graveyard destroyed. Tombstones were uprooted, smashed to pieces, and hundreds of decomposed bodies were unearthed and poured down the crashing streams, as though risen for the call of Judgment Day. Among them floated the rotting remains of Harry Morgan, black-socket eyes now beholding the destruction of his beloved city, within just 4 minutes. Some individuals had miraculously survived this incredible disaster. Emmanuel Heath made it to his home, where he surveyed his situation from his balcony. Hundreds lay dead or dying, some trapped in chasms that closed and squeezed them to death, others buried up to their necks. A group of survivors called for Emmanuel to lead them in prayer, all falling to their knees together as the ground rumbled beneath them. Among them were a group of Jews that renounced their faith and called upon Christ. While some went searching for their families and friends, a number of sailors, prostitutes, slaves, and pirates gave way for their base instincts, turning scavenger and scouring the ruins for anything of value. They stripped the dead, cut off fingers to get at the rings, plucked gold buttons from shirts, or pickled themselves on salvaged barrels of booze. Many of them killed in the continuing aftershocks, buried in collapsing structures. Elsewhere, wild dogs feasted on the dead, chewing the heads and limbs of those partially buried. Between 1,000 to 2,000 inhabitants out of Port Royal's population of 6,500 were killed in the calamity, and the death toll would only climb in the following days. Deprived of shelter, people died from exposure, and the rotting bodies and humid weather brought on a swarm of flies and mosquitoes that introduced a heap of diseases. Looting continued, and a few people were arrested for murder. At least 3,000 people died on Jamaica in the subsequent weeks. Indeed, though Port Royal had taken the brunt, the entire island had suffered, and with its prime naval base destroyed and the population ravaged, it was rendered susceptible to invasion. The French invaded the island, plundering plantations, murdering denizens, and robbing away the slaves. Many people came to question if the disaster had been a divine punishment, delivered unto Port Royal for the excessive sinning of its population, how God condemned Sodom and Gomorrah. Jamaica saw a resurgence of religious devotion, and the council ordered a day of public fast and humiliation in respect of God Almighty's severe judgment. Quaker Joseph Norris attempted to converse directly with the Lord, and receiving no reply, I guess he was busy, Norris did not eat or drink anything for however long. Eventually, God spoke to him, telling him to go to Port Royal and warn the people to repent, lest they be punished again. Norris preached on the roads and towns of Jamaica, though in a letter to his brother, he knew that his own end was nigh, possibly from a disease provoked by his fasting. Joseph got to meet his brother one final time, on the 13th of September, 1692. The day after, Joseph passed away. For many years after the cataclysmic destruction, rooftops and shipwrecks remained above the surface of the ocean, and much of the city sank gradually into it over time. Salvaging efforts started almost immediately after the calamity. The Navy was primarily interested in recovering sunken artillery, but some private persons also employed divers to recover their old possessions, usually money and valuables. Since the roofs consisted of wooden shingles, they were easy enough to break open and get inside. The bottom of the sea was dredged with weighted nets, and items visible from the surface were fished up with long poles. In some cases, fishermen hunting sharks discovered treasure in their bloated bellies. Salvaging continued on a large scale for several decades, leaving next to no actual treasures for modern Indiana Jones types. Though it hasn't stopped people from trying their luck in the sunken pirate city. For the historian and archaeologist, the real treasure of Port Royal has been the hundreds and thousands of everyday items and artifacts, giving us an insight into this time period and the daily lives of the citizenry. The sunken city has proven a virtual museum, with many of the houses remarkably well preserved. Indeed, Port Royal is indisputably the most important marine archaeological site in the Western Hemisphere. Excavations have been ongoing since the mid-20th century, with one of the largest conducted by Robert Marx. One of his most remarkable findings included the iconic stopwatch seen throughout the video. Made of brass, the minute and hour hands had disintegrated by the time of discovery, but X-ray analysis revealed that it had stopped at 11:43 a.m., corresponding to the recorded time of the disaster. After the watch had been cleaned, an investigation revealed that it had been made around 1686 by a Frenchman living in the Netherlands named Paul Blondel. With the quay reduced to a mere 25 acres, less than half the size of just the town alone at its height, a proposal was made to construct a new hub for trade. But merchants and sailors soon flocked again to Port Royal. Owing to the lack of space, the buildings were tightly packed together. Being made of wood, it was an obvious fire hazard, and in 1703, most of the town was consumed by flame. Leading figures proposed the establishment of a new trade hub on Jamaica. They settled on the former town of Ligania, now called Kingston, a growing settlement on the mainland just north across the bay. Some opposed the decision, since Port Royal was more accessible by sea and overall more healthy. But Kingston had more space for development and was less vulnerable to accident and earthquake. In the end, both settlements were allowed to grow simultaneously, but Port Royal suffered a slow decline. It degenerated into a slum comparable to London's poorest neighborhoods, the streets and houses low, small, and irregular. Jamaican authorities forced their slaves to empty their chamber pots at a waste heap upwind from Port Royal, sending down a terrible stench into the unfortunate town. It was only frequented by sailors, privateers, and the occasional merchants. Long gone were its days as a pirate capital, and those flying the black flag were condemned there instead. In late 1720, pirates Charles Vane and John Rackham were executed there, the latter having the honor of a small island named after him, Rackham's Cay. Upon these paltry shores, the broken body of this paltry man was put on display in a gibbet. Port Royal suffered two additional disasters between 1712 and 1722, the latter of whom killed 400 people and destroyed half the town. Future settlers were deterred, and for the rest of the century, Port Royal merely survived as a naval station. The point was fortified to resist invasions and used as a staging ground for naval missions in the Caribbean. Vice Admiral Edward Vernon, mostly known for pioneering grog, the watered-down bane of any true sailor, used the point to refit his fleet, before undertaking a mission to Portobello, not unlike old Harry Morgan. We are so back, baby. The raid was an astounding success. The next year he joined forces with Chaloner Ogle, the man who had defeated Bartholomew Roberts, at one point the world's most notorious pirate, assembling a fleet some 124 sail strong. They tried to complete Morgan's dream of taking Cartagena, but were beaten off after a months-long siege and streak of arguments. Their forces had been augmented by many of the old pirates and privateers. This was their final hurrah, for the golden age was long since over, of them and Port Royal both. There has been some interest in my consultation for creative projects, so if you wish to hire me for your novel or game design or whatever else, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can hire me. I offer research, proofreading, editing, critique, very harsh critique, but we can also just talk, spitball ideas, or whatever other suggestions you have. You'll find a Fiverr link in the video description or pinned comment below, or you can contact me via Discord or email. Otherwise, support Gold Gunpowder by liking, clicking the subscribe button and bell to get notified of new releases, and if you truly enjoy this content and have the resources, nothing helps more than $1 a month via channel membership or Patreon subscription. You'll also get early, ad-free access to weekly pirate content. Ooh, now that's a killer deal if I ever saw one.